Maria had been working in the tall glass building for so many years that she had lost count. Every morning before the sun rose, she walked through the quiet streets carrying her small cleaning bag. By the time the office workers arrived, the floors were shining, the desks were dust-free, and the boardroom looked perfect for the important meetings that would happen later. She never complained about the hard work. She simply did her job with quiet dedication. Yet for most of the people who worked in the company, Maria was invisible. When the employees walked past her in the hallways, very few even greeted her. Some would glance at her quickly and then look away, as if her presence didn't matter. Others simply ignored her, walking by while talking loudly on their phones or laughing with their colleagues. Maria didn't let it bother her on the outside, but deep inside, she sometimes wished that someone would at least smile and say thank you. After all, without her, the office would not look so neat and professional. Still, she reminded herself that she had a responsibility. She had bills to pay and a family to support. Her work was important to her, even if it wasn't important to others. She felt proud whenever she saw the polished tables in the boardroom or the shiny floor in the main hallway. But no one ever noticed her effort. They noticed the clean office, but not the woman behind it. Many times Maria would overhear conversations while she was cleaning. Executives wearing expensive suits discussed million-dollar deals, promotions, and company strategies. They spoke as though they were the only people who mattered in the building. When they saw her nearby, they sometimes lowered their voices or ignored her completely, as if she was incapable of understanding their words. This behavior always made her heart heavy, but she kept sweeping, dusting, and wiping as though their silence did not affect her. Some employees were even crueler. A few of the younger staff mocked her simple clothes, whispering jokes when she passed by. They laughed at her old cleaning cart, the faded gloves she wore, and the plain lunch she ate in the corner of the cafeteria. She heard them sometimes, but she never reacted. Maria knew that dignity came from within, and she refused to let their shallow words drag her down. She had lived through harder times than office gossip. Even though she was treated this way, Maria had a quiet strength about her. She moved gracefully through her tasks, polishing the windows and arranging the chairs with care. Her silence gave her a mysterious presence, though most people failed to notice. She was like the foundation of the building, always there, holding everything together, yet invisible to those who only looked at the surface. Every once in a while, Maria thought about her past and how different things could have been. Years ago, she had made choices that brought her to this job. Life had tested her in ways no one in the office could imagine. She had faced loss, disappointment, and struggles that would have broken weaker spirits. But instead of giving up, she chose to keep working, to keep moving forward. That resilience lived in her eyes, even if most people never looked closely enough to see it. In the evenings, when the office became quiet again, Maria often stood alone in the boardroom. She would look at the long, polished table, the tall leather chairs, and the projector screen that executives use to share their big ideas. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to sit in one of those chairs, to be respected, to have her voice heard. But she never stayed in that dream for too long. She would pick up her mop, straighten the chairs, and lock the door behind her, preparing for another day when no one would notice her presence. Although she appeared humble, Maria held a secret pride. She knew that without her, the boardroom would not shine, the hallways would not sparkle, and the office would not feel as professional as it did. She was the silent hand behind the beauty of the workplace. She carried that truth inside her heart like a hidden jewel, even when others treated her like she didn't exist. Day after day, Maria kept working, and day after day, the workers kept overlooking her. To them, she was just the cleaning lady. But what they didn't know was that Maria's story was far bigger than they could ever imagine. What they didn't realize was that one day, the very woman they ignored would stand at the center of the boardroom, not with a mop, but with the power to change everything. Every workplace has its whispers, and Maria's company was no different. While most ignored her completely, a few made her the subject of casual jokes. The mocking often started small, with a smirk or a laugh as she pushed her cleaning cart through the hallways. At first, Maria thought maybe she was imagining it, but soon she realized the jokes were real. Some employees would roll their eyes when she entered a room, while others would nudge each other and giggle as if her presence was something funny. They mocked her old uniform, faded from years of washing. "Looks like she's wearing the same thing every day," One junior executive whispered loud enough for her to hear. Another added, "Well, what else can you expect from a cleaning lady?" They chuckled, proud of their little comments as if humiliating her made them more important. Maria pretended not to notice, but inside each word cut a little deeper. She reminded herself to stay calm. At lunchtime, Maria would sit quietly at the far corner of the cafeteria. She usually packed a simple meal, rice, beans, or bread with a bit of fruit. While she ate, she often felt the weight of eyes on her. Some workers made fun of her food, whispering things like, "I bet she's never even been to a real restaurant." They didn't know that Maria once lived a very different life, one where dining in fine places was normal. But she never corrected them. She let them believe their lies because she knew the truth didn't need to be spoken. It lived inside her. The cruelest mockery came when she was cleaning during late hours. Many nights, when most employees had gone home, a small group of managers would linger behind, talking loudly in the boardroom. When Maria entered to tidy up, they sometimes joked, "Careful, the cleaning lady might steal our documents," or "Better hide the silverware." The laughter that followed echoed in the room like a sting. Maria's hands never stopped working, dusting, wiping, polishing, but her ears caught every cruel word. Sometimes they didn't just laugh at her. They used her as a way to entertain themselves. One evening, when Maria walked past the open office door of two executives, she overheard them joking about how people like her should be grateful for any job. One of them even said, "Imagine if she ever thought she could sit in this boardroom." What a joke. They both laughed loudly, not realizing that the very woman they mocked could one day decide their future. Despite the ridicule, Maria carried herself with quiet grace. She never raised her voice, never complained, and never responded to the insults. Her silence confused some people. They wondered why she didn't fight back or cry. What they didn't understand was that Maria's strength was built from years of surviving life's hardships. She had lost much more than their words could ever take away. Compared to the storms she had weathered, their jokes were nothing more than passing winds. Still, there were nights when Maria went home with a heavy heart. Sitting by the window of her small apartment, she would replay their words in her head. She wondered why people found it so easy to mock those who worked quietly in the background. Was it because they thought her work was small? Or was it because they needed someone weaker to look down on to feel strong themselves? She didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing. People's true character always revealed itself in the way they treated others. While they laughed at her, Maria studied them. She noticed how the CEO strutted with arrogance, how the managers fought among themselves for promotions, and how greed often blinded the smartest of them. They thought she wasn't watching, but Maria saw everything. In silence, she was learning more about them than they could ever imagine. The mockery that was meant to break her spirit instead became her shield. Every cruel word only reminded her to stay humble, to remain patient, and to trust that life always balanced itself in the end. She didn't know when or how, but she believed that a day would come when those who laughed at her would finally see her true worth. For now, she let them laugh. She let them mock her uniform, her food, her silence. She carried her mop and broom with quiet dignity, all the while hiding a powerful truth deep within her heart. The day would come when the same people who mocked her would sit in shocked silence as she stood before them, not as a cleaner, but as a woman of authority. Maria's life was far more complicated than anyone in the office could ever guess. To them, she was just a cleaning lady with worn shoes, a faded uniform, and a quiet presence. But hidden behind her humble appearance was a truth that would one day shake the entire company. Years earlier, before she ever carried a mop or wiped down desks, Maria had been in a very different place in life. She was not always poor, and she was not always invisible. She had once been married to a man who believed in her strength and supported her dreams. Together, they had invested in a small startup company, a business that, with time and determination, grew into the very corporation she now worked for. Maria had been there in the early days when the company was just an idea on paper. She had sat in small rooms with hopeful young entrepreneurs, sharing ideas, offering advice, and putting in money she and her husband had saved over many years. But life is not always kind. When Maria's husband fell ill, everything changed. The medical bills swallowed their savings. While Maria cared for him, she had to give up her position in the company. On paper, she still held shares, but no one in the office knew her name or her story. The executives who had once thanked her disappeared as the company grew bigger. By the time her husband passed away, Maria found herself alone, heartbroken, and struggling to survive. To support herself, she took on small jobs and eventually, she accepted the cleaning position at the very company she had helped build. It was almost ironic, cleaning the floors of Boardroom she once entered as an investor. But Maria chose not to reveal her past. She wanted to see the company from the eyes of an ordinary worker. She wanted to understand how people truly behaved when they thought no one important was watching. Every time she entered the boardroom with her cleaning supplies, she remembered those early days. She recalled the excitement, the plans, the hope. Now the room was filled with men and women in expensive suits who didn't even glance at her. They didn't know that the very table they sat around was partly hers. They didn't know she still had legal documents that gave her power. And Maria didn't tell them, at least not yet. Her shares in the company were her hidden strength, her secret weapon. While the executives mocked her, she carried proof in her small apartment, a folder filled with signed papers, contracts, and certificates that showed her silent ownership. She kept them safe, tucked away in a drawer, and sometimes at night she would take them out, read them, and remind herself of who she really was. To her neighbors and co-workers, Maria was nothing more than a quiet woman who worked too hard for too little money. But behind her silence was a fire that hadn't gone out. She knew she still had a claim to the empire she had once helped nurture. She knew she still had rights that no amount of mocking could erase. The secret gave her strength. When others laughed at her old shoes, she thought of the documents locked safely away. When they mocked her for eating simple meals, she remembered that she had once shared dinners with powerful investors, and could do so again if she wished. Every insult only reminded her that her silence was not weakness, it was choice. Maria believed in patience. She told herself that timing was everything. The right moment would come when her truth could no longer stay hidden. And when that moment arrived, the same people who looked down on her would be forced to look up at her. But until then, she continued to play her part. She swept the floors, wiped the tables, and emptied the bins, never revealing what she truly carried in her heart and her past. Her secret was her armor, and she guarded it carefully. The boardroom became her stage, and the executives were too blind to see the real story unfolding in front of them. For now they saw only a cleaning lady, but Maria knew that the day was coming when they would see her as something far greater, an owner, a leader, a woman they should never have underestimated. And as she left the office late at night, walking through the empty hallways, she often smiled to herself, because she knew something the others didn't. The company's future was not entirely in their hands. It was also in hers. The man who sat at the head of the long boardroom table was the kind of person people noticed the moment he entered a room. His name was Richard Lawson, but almost everyone called him Mr. Lawson, partly out of respect and partly out of fear. He wore tailored suits that cost more than Maria's monthly salary. His shoes were polished so well they shone under the lights, and his watch was always a brand that most employees only saw in glossy magazines. He carried himself like he owned the world, and in his eyes, perhaps he truly believed he did. From the very beginning of his career, Lawson had been known for his ambition. He clawed his way up the corporate ladder, making bold moves and taking risks that frightened others. But with his ambition came arrogance. He believed that power belonged to people like him. People who spoke loudly, commanded attention, and wore wealth like a crown. In his view, those who worked simple jobs, people like Maria, were not worth more than a passing glance. Lawson had a habit of turning every room into his stage. When he spoke, he wanted silence. When he laughed, others forced themselves to laugh louder, even when the joke wasn't funny. He enjoyed seeing people scramble to please him, to earn his approval. And the more he saw them bend to his will, the more convinced he became that he was untouchable. Maria had seen many powerful men in her lifetime, but none as shamelessly arrogant as Lawson. Unlike others, he did not hide his disdain for those he considered beneath him. On more than one occasion, Maria overheard him speaking badly about his own employees, mocking their weaknesses, laughing at their mistakes, and even bragging about how easily he could replace them. He thrived on control. To him, people were tools to be used and discarded when no longer useful. His arrogance showed most when Maria entered the boardroom. Whenever she came in to wipe the table or arrange the chairs before meetings, Lawson would lean back in his chair, smirk, and make loud comments designed to humiliate her. "Careful with that mop or you'll flood the boardroom," he once said, and the room burst into forced laughter. Another time he joked, "Do you know how lucky you are to clean this floor? Some people would give anything just to be inside this room and you get paid for it." Maria never responded. She lowered her eyes, cleaned quietly, and walked out with dignity. But deep inside she felt the sting of his words. Not because they made her feel small, but because she knew how wrong he was. He saw only a cleaning lady, but he had no idea that the woman standing in front of him had more claim to the company than he did. Lawson's arrogance spread like a shadow across the workplace. Employees worked in constant fear of him. They knew that if they upset him even slightly, they could lose their jobs. He was quick to anger and slow to forgive. When things didn't go his way, he slammed his fists on the table, raised his voice, and pointed fingers. Some admired his strength, mistaking his cruelty for leadership. Others despised him quietly but never dared to say a word. What Lawson never realized was that his arrogance blinded him. He failed to see the cracks forming beneath his empire. He failed to notice how employees whispered in the hallways about his unfair treatment. He failed to recognize that real power often lies not in loud words but in quiet actions. Maria, though silent, noticed everything. She saw the way Lawson treated people like disposable objects. She watched how his arrogance grew each year, how he became more careless with his words, more reckless with his decisions, and though he never suspected it, she studied him the way one studies a storm, waiting for the moment it would finally collapse under its own weight. To Lawson, the boardroom was his kingdom. The tall glass windows, the polished table, the leather chairs, all symbols of his control. He never imagined that someone like Maria could ever challenge that authority. He saw her as background noise, like the ticking of a clock or the hum of an air conditioner. Invisible, unimportant, forgettable. But Maria was none of those things. Every time Lawson mocked her, every time he dismissed her presence, he unknowingly gave her more strength. His arrogance became the very thing that fueled her patience. She knew that one day the roles would be reversed. One day the man who laughed the loudest would fall silent, and the woman he mocked would stand in his place with undeniable authority. For now, Lawson continued to rule with arrogance. He walked through the hallways as though they belonged to him. He spoke in board meetings as though his word was final, and he treated Maria with the same disdain as always, never realizing that the cleaning lady he mocked carried the power to end his reign. The stage was set. Lawson's arrogance was building higher and higher, like a tower made of glass, shiny on the outside but fragile at its core. And Maria, quiet and patient, was waiting for the moment when a single touch would make the whole thing come crashing down. The day that changed everything started like any other. Maria arrived early, long before most of the staff. She moved silently through the building, her mop gliding over the marble floors, her cloth polishing the glass doors until they gleamed. The office looked perfect by the time the employees walked in, their shoes clicking against the spotless tiles she had cleaned only minutes before. To them, the office simply sparkled by itself. No one thought about the woman who made it happen. That morning, the atmosphere in the company was tense. There was a big board meeting scheduled. Rumors of falling profits had been spreading for weeks, and everyone knew the CEO, Richard Lawson, was under pressure to explain himself. Executives hurried around, carrying files, tapping nervously on their phones and whispering in corners. Maria noticed their worried faces, but she stayed focused on her work. She knew how fragile the air felt on days like this, like a storm waiting to break. When the meeting began, Maria was already in the boardroom, arranging the chairs and making sure the long, polished table was spotless. She worked quietly, moving around as if she were invisible, but Lawson noticed her. He always did. And this time, with the tension high and his pride on the line, he couldn't resist turning her into a target. As the executives settled into their seats, Lawson leaned back in his chair, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look at this," he said with a smirk, pointing in Maria's direction. "Here we are, one of the biggest companies in the country, and we've got the cleaning lady standing in our boardroom during an important meeting. Maybe she'll give us advice on profit margins. What do you think?" The room erupted in laughter. Some laughed out of fear of displeasing him, while others found cruel pleasure in the joke. Maria froze for a moment, her hands resting on the back of a chair. The laughter echoed around her, bouncing off the walls, stinging more than usual. Lawson wasn't done. He loved the attention. Maybe we should make her CEO for a day, he continued mockingly. She can mop the floors and fire the executives who don't shine as bright as the table she cleans. More laughter filled the room. Even those who didn't want to laugh joined in, afraid of being singled out. Maria stood there silently, her face calm, her eyes lowered, but inside her chest something stirred. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something deeper. It was the weight of years of silence, of years of watching people like Lawson walk over others without a second thought. It was the quiet strength of someone who had been underestimated for far too long. For a moment she thought about leaving the room, the way she always did. She could have ignored the laughter, gone back to her duties and let the day pass like any other. But this time felt different. Something inside her told her it was time. The mocking had gone too far. The humiliation had reached its breaking point. She straightened her back slowly, her hands no longer shaking. She looked up, not at the floor, not at the table, but directly at Lawson. The sudden change in her posture silenced a few of the chuckles around the table. No one had ever seen her look like that before. Lawson, noticing her stare, raised an eyebrow. "Well, do you have something to say, Maria?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. The room went quiet. Even the executives shifted nervously, unsure of what was about to happen. Maria's voice was calm when she finally spoke, but there was a weight to it, a firmness that no one could ignore. "You mock me because you think I am only a cleaning lady," she said softly, yet every word carried across the room. "But you don't know who I am. You don't know what I have built, what I have sacrificed, and what I still hold." A nervous laugh escaped from one of the managers, but it died quickly when Maria reached into her bag. From it, she pulled a thick folder, old but carefully protected. She placed it on the table in front of Lawson with deliberate care. The sound of the folder hitting the polished wood echoed in the silence of the boardroom. "This," she continued, her eyes locked on Lawson's, "is proof that I am not just a worker in this company. I am part of its foundation. I was here before many of you ever dreamed of being in this room. And unlike you, Mr. Lawson, I don't need to humiliate others to prove my worth." Gasps spread around the table as the executives exchanged glances. Lawson's smirk faltered for the first time. He leaned forward, flipping open the folder with a nervous hand. Inside were documents, share certificates, contracts, and agreements bearing her name. For the first time, Maria wasn't invisible. For the first time, everyone in the boardroom saw her for who she truly was. Not a cleaning lady, but a woman with power, a woman with authority, a woman with the right to stand at the very table where she had once been mocked. The breaking point had come. The silence in the room was heavier than any laughter. Lawson's face turned pale, his arrogance cracking like glass under pressure. Maria had not raised her voice, she had not shouted. But her quiet truth had broken through louder than anything he had ever said. And as she stood there, calm and unshaken, every person in that room understood one thing. The balance of power had shifted. The boardroom was so quiet that even the ticking clock on the wall seemed louder than usual. For years, Maria had been overlooked, mocked, and treated as if she were invisible. But now, standing tall with her folder of documents spread out on the glossy table, she commanded more attention than Lawson ever had in his finest speech. Every eye in the room was fixed on her, and every breath seemed to hang heavy in the air. Lawson, who had mocked her moments before, leaned forward with disbelief. His fingers trembled slightly as he flipped through the papers. He was searching for some mistake, some reason to laugh it all off. But the signatures were there. The dates were there. The proof was undeniable. One of the senior board members, a man with gray hair and a sharp mind, adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to the documents. His eyes widened as he scanned the lines. This shows significant shares," he murmured, his voice breaking the silence. "She has more claim to this company than most of us sitting here." A wave of whispers spread across the table. Executives who had laughed minutes ago now exchanged uneasy glances. They looked at Maria differently, no longer as the cleaning lady, but as someone who held real power in her hands. Maria's voice was steady as she spoke again. "For years I chose silence. I let you all see me as only the woman who polished your tables and emptied your bins. But long before many of you joined this company, I was there. I invested when there was nothing but hope and vision. I believed in the dream that built these walls. And while life took me down a different path, I never gave up my share of what I helped to create. Her words carried no anger, only truth, and that truth hit harder than any outburst could have. Lawson slammed the folder shut and tried to regain control. "This is nonsense," he snapped, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "So what if you have a few old papers? That doesn't mean you belong at this table." But Maria did not flinch. She leaned forward slightly, her calm gaze piercing through him. "These papers give me authority you cannot erase, Mr. Lawson. Authority you have mocked without even knowing it. I am not asking for your approval. I already have the legal right to be here." The gray-haired board member nodded slowly. "She's telling the truth," he said firmly. "These documents prove her stake. If she wishes, she can vote on matters of leadership, including the position of CEO." The room froze. All the arrogance drained from Lawson's face. For the first time, he realized the danger he was in. The woman he had humiliated countless times now held the power to decide his fate. Maria picked up the folder and held it close to her chest. "You mocked me because you thought I was powerless. You laughed at me because you thought my job defined me. But today the truth is here in front of you, and the truth cannot be mocked away." Some of the executives lowered their eyes, ashamed of the laughter they had shared at her expense. Others stared at her in awe, realizing they had underestimated her all along. Lawson, desperate to save face, tried one last time to belittle her. "You may have papers, but you don't belong in this room. You're nothing more than a cleaner." Maria took a slow breath. Her voice, though soft, cut sharper than any shout. "If I am nothing more than a cleaner, then what does it say about you, Mr. Lawson, that the cleaner now has the power to remove you from your throne?" The silence that followed was heavier than any laughter had ever been. The question hung in the air, and no one dared to answer it. For the first time, Lawson's authority cracked. His face flushed red, his jaw clenched, but his hands betrayed him with a slight shake. The mighty CEO who had ruled with arrogance was now cornered by the very woman he had ridiculed. Maria didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice or demand apologies. Her calm presence alone was enough to make the room feel smaller, tighter, suffocating for those who had mocked her. The reveal was not just about the documents. It was about the truth that no one could deny anymore. She was not invisible. She was not powerless. She was a force none of them had expected. And as she stood there, folder in hand, every person in the boardroom knew the same undeniable fact. Richard Lawson's reign was no longer secure. The woman he had dismissed as just the cleaning lady had just revealed herself as one of the most powerful people in the company. The shock was complete. The balance of the room had shifted, and for Lawson it was the beginning of the end. For a long moment after Maria's revelation, the boardroom was silent. The executives sat stiffly in their leather chairs, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. The cleaning lady, the woman they had mocked for years, had shattered the illusion of Richard Lawson's control with a single folder of papers. No one dared move. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner, filling the room with an almost eerie stillness. Richard Lawson, however, could not accept silence. He had built his career on being the loudest voice in the room, the man who always dominated the conversation. His pride would not let him stay quiet, not even now when his authority was collapsing. "This is absurd," he barked, slamming his palm against the table. "You think you can come in here with some dusty old papers and take control? This is my company. I built this empire. I lead this board, and no one, especially not the cleaning lady, can tell me otherwise." His voice shook with anger, but his words no longer carried the same weight. The executives, who usually nodded along, looked down at their hands instead, unwilling to meet his eyes. His usual audience had vanished. For once, no one laughed at his jokes or joined his insults. They were waiting, watching, to see what Maria would do next. Maria remained calm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She placed the folder back on the table and looked at Lawson with a steady gaze that unnerved him more than any outburst could. "You speak of building an empire," she said softly, "but an empire built on arrogance and disrespect cannot last. This company was not made by you alone. It was built by many hands, many sacrifices, including mine. And now, the same arrogance that made you mock others is the arrogance that will bring your downfall." The gray-haired board member cleared his throat and finally spoke, his voice deliberate. "Mr. Lawson, whether you like it or not, Maria has legal rights. With the shares she holds, she has the power to call for a vote. If she wishes to challenge your position as CEO, this board is obligated to hear her. Lawson's face turned pale, but he tried to cover it with rage. You wouldn't dare, he growled at Maria. Maria's lips curved into the faintest smile, not of cruelty but of quiet justice. I dare, she said simply. And I will. The words fell into the room like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that no one could ignore. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded, some even relieved, as though they had been waiting for someone to stand up to Lawson all along. I call for an immediate vote of confidence in the leadership of Richard Lawson, Maria announced, her voice clear and unwavering. The executives glanced at one another. There was no turning back now. The vote had been called, and by law it had to be taken. One by one, hands began to rise. At first only a few dared, their movements hesitant. But then, seeing the tide shifting, more hands lifted until the majority of the boardroom signaled their decision. When the last hand was raised, the gray-haired board member spoke again. The majority has spoken. Richard Lawson, you are hereby dismissed as CEO of this company. The words echoed like a thunderclap. Lawson's jaw dropped as though he had been struck. His arrogance, his certainty, his untouchable pride, all of it crumbled in an instant. You can't do this to me, he shouted, his voice breaking. I made this company what it is. You're nothing without me. But his words were powerless now. Security guards had already been called in by a discreet signal from one of the executives. The tall men in uniform stepped into the room, their presence unshakable. Mr. Lawson, one of them said firmly, you'll need to come with us. Lawson's face turned red with fury. He looked around the room, searching desperately for support, but none of the executives met his eyes. He looked at Maria last, his expression a mixture of disbelief and hatred. You'll regret this, he spat. Maria didn't flinch. Her calm gaze met his storm. No, she replied softly. It is you who will regret underestimating the people you thought were beneath you. The guards took Lawson by the arms. He resisted for a moment, but their grip was strong. The man who had once strutted proudly through these halls was now being escorted out of the very boardroom he had ruled. The doors closed behind him with a heavy finality, leaving the room in stunned silence. Maria stood at the head of the table now, the same place Lawson had sat moments before. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice or smile triumphantly. She simply looked at the faces around her and said, let this be a lesson. No job is too small. No person is invisible. Respect should not depend on a title or a suit. If we want this company to survive, it must be built on dignity, not arrogance. Her words struck deeper than any order Lawson had ever given. For the first time, the executives felt not fear, but respect. And as Maria left the room that day, she carried herself not as a cleaner, not as a victim of mockery, but as a leader who had restored balance with quiet strength. The dismissal was complete. The boardroom would never be the same. After Richard Lawson was escorted out of the boardroom, silence lingered like a shadow. The executives sat frozen, struggling to process what had just happened. The woman they had ignored for years, the same woman they once saw, pushing a mop and carrying buckets, had just reshaped the future of the company in a single afternoon. Maria didn't stand in the boardroom like a conqueror celebrating victory. She didn't raise her voice or demand applause. She simply gathered her folder of documents, tucked it under her arm, and looked around the table with calm eyes. There was no arrogance in her face, no desire to humiliate those who had mocked her. Instead, there was a quiet strength, a dignity that made everyone in the room lower their gaze. In that moment, the executives realized something important. Power was not always loud. Sometimes real power walks silently, unnoticed until the right moment came to reveal itself. News of the dramatic meeting spread quickly throughout the company. By the next day, every employee, from the newest intern to the senior managers, knew the story. They whispered it in the hallways, repeated it in the cafeteria, and even sent it in hurried messages to friends. The cleaning lady dismissed the CEO. It sounded unbelievable, almost like a legend, but it was true. For the employees who had once laughed at her, the memory of their cruelty burned with shame. Some avoided her in the halls, too embarrassed to face her. Others approached her quietly, offering small nods of respect or whispered apologies. Maria accepted them with grace, but she didn't dwell on the past. She believed that true change wasn't about punishing people for their mistakes. It was about teaching them to do better. Soon, the company itself began to change. The culture of arrogance that Lawson had fostered slowly dissolved. Executives who once strutted around with inflated pride now thought twice before speaking down to others. Managers began treating their teams with more respect, realizing that every role mattered. Even the youngest employees who had once joined in mocking Maria began to greet her warmly whenever they saw her. But Maria herself remained the same. She continued her duties quietly, still polishing the floors, still arranging the chairs, still wiping down the windows until they sparkled. To many, this surprised them. They expected her to abandon the role of cleaner now that her authority had been revealed. Yet Maria stayed, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. For her, cleaning was never a shameful job. It was honest work, and she did it with pride. She wanted everyone in the company to understand that dignity was not tied to a job title. A CEO was no more valuable than a janitor. Both contributed in different ways and both deserved respect. This simple truth spread like fire through the company culture. It became a story managers shared with new employees during orientation. Never underestimate anyone. Never mock someone because of their role. Respect is the foundation of everything we do. And outside the walls of the office, Maria's story continued to echo. Friends told friends. Families repeated it at dinner tables. Soon it became an example shared in classrooms, in leadership seminars, and even in casual conversations. People called it the boardroom lesson, a reminder that arrogance blinds but respect empowers. Maria herself never sought fame from what happened. She didn't see herself as a hero. To her, the lesson was simple. People should be valued for who they are, not for the uniforms they wear or the titles they hold. But for those who had witnessed that unforgettable day in the boardroom, she was more than a lesson. She was a living reminder of humility, patience, and quiet strength. They had seen her walk into the room as the cleaning lady and leave as a symbol of respect and justice. Years later, employees still spoke of that day as if it had just happened. Some said it changed how they treated their coworkers forever. Others admitted it changed how they treated strangers outside of work too. Cashiers, drivers, waiters, cleaners. The story lived on, shaping hearts and minds long after Lawson's name had been forgotten. Maria, however, never changed. Every evening she left the office the same way she always had, quietly with her cleaning bag in hand and her shoulders steady. Yet to those who saw her, she was no longer invisible. Every nod, every smile, every respectful, "Good evening, Maria," carried the weight of the lesson she had taught them all. The lasting lesson was clear. Never underestimate anyone. Respect should never be earned by wealth or position. It should be given freely to every human being. Because the person you mock today may hold the power to change your world tomorrow. And with that truth shining brighter than the polished floors she left behind each night, Maria's story lived on, not as the tale of a cleaning lady, but as the legacy of a woman who turned quiet dignity into unshakable strength.